For years, we believed technology was the main force shaping modern life, but beneath the surface, something far less visible was quietly rewriting how entire societies behave. While the world focused on apps, AI, and innovation, a hidden current was flowing underneath everything, cheap money shaping how all of it actually functions. As borrowing became easier, human behavior began to change. Risk stopped feeling dangerous, ambition expanded, and financial decisions started to feel almost effortless. Because the price of money isn't just an economic number, it's a psychological signal that tells people what is safe, what is possible, and what is worth attempting. And when that signal shifts, when interest rates rise, the entire system reacts, not slowly, but emotionally, across markets, households, and governments at the same time. If cheap money reshaped how we think, how we spend, and how we take risks, what happens when that era begins to fade? When money becomes expensive again, the illusion of stability starts to break. What once felt permanent suddenly feels fragile. Assets that rose effortlessly for years begin to slow, and people realize those gains were not only about innovation, but about easy credit behind the scenes. And as conditions tighten, the psychology shifts again, risk-taking fades, caution returns, and the same system that once felt unstoppable starts to feel heavy. This is where reality reappears, not through a single event, but through pressure building across debt, markets, and everyday life all at once. Because when liquidity shrinks, everything connected to it reacts. Housing, startups, investments, and even personal decisions all tighten together. And in that moment, societies rediscover something they had almost forgotten, that growth is never guaranteed, and every boom carries a hidden cost. The system doesn't collapse because of one mistake. It adjusts because the conditions that supported it begin to change. Cheap money didn't just affect markets, it affected behavior. It changed how people think about risk, reward, and the future itself. And that leaves us with the final reflection. If cheap money shaped the modern world more than we realized, then the next era won't just be an economic shift, it will be a psychological one. As the cycle turns, people begin to realize something uncomfortable. The environment they grew used to was never normal, just unusually easy. What felt like permanent progress was often temporary acceleration, powered by conditions that cannot last forever. And when those conditions change, societies don't just adjust their numbers, they adjust their expectations, their confidence, and their sense of what is possible. This is why transitions feel so painful. It's not only wealth being reshaped, it's identity being redefined. Because people don't live in economies directly, they live inside expectations shaped by those economies. And once expectations change, everything else follows, slowly at first, then all at once, reshaping how an entire generation sees the future. In the next phase, societies begin rebuilding their assumptions, but not from zero. They rebuild from the memory of the last cycle. Some people become more cautious, shaped by loss. Others become more aggressive, shaped by what they still believe is possible. And so the divide deepens between those who trust stability again and those who only trust acceleration. Markets reflect this tension constantly, swinging between optimism and fear, expansion and contraction, belief and doubt. But underneath all of it, the same force remains in the background, the price of money quietly steering behavior without ever announcing itself. And that is the final truth of this story. Economies don't just move because of innovation or policy. They move because incentives shift, and incentives are often shaped long before anyone notices. So the real question isn't just what comes next in markets or technology. It's what comes next in human behavior when the invisible conditions that shaped an entire era begin to change again. Because every cycle ends the same way, not with prediction, but with realization that the world was never as stable or as simple as it seemed. Eventually the system doesn't announce a new era, it quietly slips into it. People only realize it afterward. The same tools remain, the same technologies exist, but the environment around them feels different, less forgiving, more constrained. Opportunities don't disappear, but they become harder to access, harder to finance, and harder to justify. And in that shift, behavior changes again, not because people decide to change, but because the system stops rewarding the old behavior. What once felt like a world of endless expansion becomes a world of selective survival, where only some strategies still work. And slowly societies relearn discipline, not through choice, but through constraint. But even then, the memory of the previous era never fully disappears. It lingers in expectations, in culture, and in risk appetite. Which means every new cycle starts with an invisible shadow, the psychological imprint of the last one. And that shadow shapes everything, what people fear, what they chase, and what they believe is normal. So, the story doesn't end with a conclusion. It ends with a question that repeats itself across generations. What kind of world does this next set of incentives create? And as the cycle continues, people begin to realize something deeper. It was never just about markets or money, but about how behavior is continuously shaped by unseen conditions. Each generation inherits not just wealth or debt, but the emotional habits formed by the environment they grew up in. Some learn caution from scarcity, others learn confidence from abundance, but all of it depends on the system that surrounded them. And when that system changes, the adjustment is not only economic, it is psychological, cultural, and deeply personal. Because people don't just react to numbers on a screen, they react to what those numbers have trained them to expect. This is how entire eras are defined, not by single events, but by the long shadow of incentives shaping millions of daily decisions. And that shadow stretches into the future, influencing risk, ambition, and belief long after the original conditions are gone. So even when technology evolves, even when industries change, the deeper driver remains the same, the structure of incentives beneath it all. Which means understanding an era requires more than watching innovation. It requires understanding the invisible rules that shape behavior behind the scenes. And perhaps the final realization is this: civilizations don't just build systems of money, those systems quietly build civilizations in return. And over time, what feels like normal life is simply the current phase of a much larger cycle, one that most people never see from the inside. Because every generation enters a world already shaped by the last cycle's outcomes and assumes those conditions are permanent. But permanence is an illusion in economic systems. Conditions shift, and with them, so do expectations. What feels stable is often just a long moment of balance between forces that are constantly moving underneath. And when that balance breaks, the change feels sudden, even if it was building quietly for years. This is why the same story repeats across history. Different technologies, different policies, but similar emotional cycles. Expansion creates confidence. Confidence creates risk. Risk creates fragility. And fragility eventually resets the system. Then the cycle begins again, with new tools, new language, and a new generation believing the rules have changed. But underneath it all, the same question returns: how much of what we call progress is actually just changing incentives? And in the end, the most important lesson is simple. The world changes less through technology alone and more through the invisible forces that shape how humans choose. And as each cycle ends, people don't realize they are already inside the next one, because the transition is always gradual at first. The early signals are subtle, small shifts in rates, liquidity, and confidence that most people ignore in daily life. But over time, those small shifts accumulate until behavior across the entire system begins to look completely different. What once felt like opportunity slowly turns into risk, and what once felt like risk slowly becomes necessity. And in that reversal, societies often struggle to adapt, because memory of the previous conditions still shapes expectations. This is why transitions feel uneven. Some people adjust quickly, while others continue behaving as if nothing has changed. But the system doesn't wait for belief to catch up. It moves according to incentives, not expectations. And incentives always reflect the current price of money, not the memory of what it used to be. Which means every era eventually forces a reset in thinking, whether people are ready for it or not. And so the cycle continues, not because people fail to learn, but because the environment they learn in is always changing beneath them. And in that constant change, one pattern remains consistent. Humans always try to interpret new conditions using old experiences. That's why every new cycle feels familiar at first, even when the underlying structure has already shifted. People search for patterns they recognize, comparing today's world to the last boom, the last crisis, the last recovery. But no cycle is identical, because the level of debt, leverage, and expectations is never exactly the same twice. And even small differences in structure can create massive differences in outcomes once stress appears. This is why prediction is so difficult, not because information is missing, but because the system is always evolving. Still, one truth remains constant. Incentives always win over narratives in the long run. Narratives can delay reality, but they cannot permanently override the pressure of financial conditions. Eventually, the structure beneath the story asserts itself, and behavior adjusts to match what the system allows. And when that happens, the illusion fades, and people see the economy not as it was described, but as it actually functioned. And once the illusion fades, people begin to understand that the system was never just reacting, it was shaping reactions all along. What looked like individual choices were often responses to incentives that most people never consciously noticed. Because when money is cheap, it doesn't just change what people can afford, it changes what they believe is possible. And when money becomes expensive again, it doesn't just restrict spending, it reshapes imagination itself. This is why transitions feel so personal, because they affect not only wealth, but identity and belief. People begin to question decisions they once thought were rational and realize those decisions were shaped by the environment. And slowly the distinction becomes clearer between what people chose freely and what the system encouraged them to choose. But even that understanding comes late, after the cycle has already moved on to its next phase. Because the system never stops, it only changes conditions and lets behavior adjust in response. And so the final insight remains, we don't just live inside economies, we live inside the incentives they continuously create. And as time passes, each new generation forgets how different the previous conditions actually were. What feels normal is simply what they first encountered, not what is historically typical. This is how cycles repeat, not through ignorance, but through shifting baselines of experience. Because the human mind adapts quickly, it resets expectations to match whatever environment it is placed in. And once expectations reset, even extreme conditions start to feel ordinary. But when those conditions change again, the contrast feels extreme, even if the adjustment is gradual. That contrast is what creates emotional volatility across societies, not just economic numbers. Because people don't react to data, they react to changes in expectation. And expectations are shaped over long periods of stable incentives, not short moments of disruption. So, in the end, the story is not about one era or one policy. It is about a continuous loop where incentives quietly shape how entire civilizations think, behave, and evolve. And as the loop continues, societies rarely notice the exact moment when one era quietly becomes another, because there is no clear boundary between them. Instead, change arrives as a slow drift, subtle shifts in borrowing costs, confidence, and behavior that only become obvious in hindsight. People continue making decisions as if the old rules still apply, long after the environment has already changed. And this delay between reality and perception is where most instability begins to form. Because the system reacts immediately to incentives, but human understanding reacts slowly to new conditions. That gap creates misalignment between what people expect and what the system now actually rewards. And over time, that misalignment accumulates across millions of decisions, amplifying stress within the system. Until eventually, a correction becomes unavoidable, not because of a single failure, but because of accumulated divergence. And when that correction arrives, it feels sudden, even though it was building quietly for years beneath the surface. So the final truth remains consistent across every cycle. Economies don't just move through events, they move through shifts in perception shaped by the invisible price of money. And when the correction finally arrives, it doesn't just reset prices, it resets confidence itself. Because confidence is built slowly during long periods of stability, but it can unravel quickly when conditions change. People begin to reassess everything at once: homes, savings, investments, and even long-term plans. What once felt secure now feels uncertain, not because assets disappeared, but because the environment supporting them changed. And in that moment, the difference between perceived value and real resilience becomes visible. Some systems adapt quickly because they were built on solid foundations rather than cheap conditions. Others struggle because their strength depended on the environment staying unchanged. This separation reveals the hidden structure of the entire cycle, what was real productivity versus what was financial amplification. And once that distinction becomes clear, the narrative of constant growth starts to look more conditional than absolute. So the cycle doesn't just end with correction, it ends with understanding that the price of money was never just a number, but a force shaping how reality itself was experienced. And after that understanding emerges, the system begins to stabilize again, but on a new baseline shaped by everything that came before. Because no cycle truly resets to zero, it always carries forward the memory of its previous extremes. Debt, caution, optimism, and fear don't disappear. They simply shift form and re-enter the next phase. And so societies continue forward, adjusting not to a blank slate, but to a landscape already shaped by past incentives. This is why every new era feels both familiar and different at the same time, repetition with variation. People adapt again, expectations reset again, and confidence slowly rebuilds again. But underneath that rebuilding process, the same invisible mechanism continues to operate. The price of money still determines how much risk feels acceptable, how much growth feels possible, and how much future feels believable. And because of that, behavior never fully escapes the system, it only adjusts to its current phase.